The photograph was discovered in a cardboard box beneath a collapsed ceiling beam, water-stained and curling at the edges, showing a man in a Western suit standing before an enormous wooden gate, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression unreadable. Behind him, barely visible through morning fog, rose the silhouette of a mansion that no longer existed in any official record, a structure so deliberately erased from corporate memory that even long-time employees of the company would deny ever hearing its name. The discovery was made in 2007 by a demolition crew preparing to clear what they believed was an abandoned factory complex on the outskirts of Nagoya. But when they broke through a sealed storage room in the basement of Building C, they found not machinery or inventory but rooms filled with furniture draped in canvas, walls covered in silk panels depicting scenes from the Kojiki, and, in the center of the largest chamber, a desk made of Yakushima cedar, its surface still bearing the circular stains from countless cups of tea. On that desk lay a single document, a resignation letter dated March 1950, written in the founder's own hand, unsigned, the ink faded to the color of rust. The crew supervisor, a man named Takeshi Yamamoto who had worked for Toyota subsidiaries his entire adult life, recognized the handwriting immediately, not because he had ever seen it before, but because it resembled so precisely the script taught in company training seminars as the exemplar of proper business correspondence, the standard against which all other writing was measured. He stood in that dusty room for 17 minutes, according to his own later testimony, simply staring at the letter, trying to understand why a document of such obvious significance had been hidden in a place designed to be forgotten. The mansion itself, what remained of it, stood 300 meters away through a thicket of bamboo that had grown so dense over 5 decades that it formed a natural wall, impenetrable without industrial equipment. When they finally cut through, what they found was not ruins in the conventional sense but rather a structure that appeared to have been deliberately preserved in a state of partial decay, as if someone had wanted to maintain it precisely at the threshold between existence and disappearance. Neither fully destroyed nor adequately protected, suspended in a kind of architectural purgatory. The story, like all stories of industrial empires built on the transformation of one technology into another, begins not with wealth, but with obsession. Kiichiro Toyoda was born in 1867 in a small village in Shizuoka Prefecture, the son of a carpenter who worked with wood the way other men worked with water or air, instinctively, as if the material itself whispered its intentions to him. But Sakichi's obsession was not wood. It was the loom. More specifically, it was the sound his mother made, a particular exhalation of exhaustion mixed with resignation. Every evening as she sat before her hand loom, weaving fabric for sale at markets that paid almost nothing for work that consumed almost everything. He was 9 years old when he first tried to modify her loom, adding a mechanism he had carved from bamboo that was supposed to make the shuttle move faster. It broke within minutes. He was 12 when he tried again, this time studying mechanical drawings he had found in a book borrowed from a traveling merchant. That attempt lasted almost a week before a thread tension problem caused the whole apparatus to jam. He was 15 when he succeeded, creating a modification that increased weaving speed by nearly 20%. And his mother wept, not because of the achievement but because she finally understood that her son would leave their village and never truly return. The pattern established itself early. Failure, study, modification, partial success, obsession deepening with each iteration. By 1890, at the age of 23, Sakichi had invented his first fully automatic loom, a device that could detect when a thread broke and stop the machine instantly, preventing defects from cascading through the entire fabric. The economic implications were staggering. One worker could now supervise dozens of looms instead of one. Production costs fell, quality improved. And Kiichiro Toyoda, the carpenter's son from a village so small it appeared on no maps, became the man who transformed Japanese textile manufacturing from cottage industry to industrial power. Money followed inevitably, in amounts that seemed almost obscene to a man who had grown up in a house with a dirt floor. He founded Toyota Automatic Loom Works in 1926, a company that quickly became one of the most valuable textile machinery manufacturers in Asia, with factories in Nagoya, Shanghai, and eventually throughout the colonial territories of the Japanese Empire. But Sakichi's obsession had shifted. Textile looms, he believed, were merely the beginning. The real revolution would come from automobiles, from personal transportation powered by internal combustion engines. Technology he had seen demonstrated in Tokyo by foreign engineers and had immediately recognized as the next transformation. The next way to reshape how human beings moved through space and time. His son, Kiichiro Toyoda, was born in 1894, in the middle of his father's first great success with looms, and from his earliest memories he was surrounded not by toys, but by prototypes. Not by stories, but by technical specifications. Not by affection, but by expectations. The photograph from his childhood that survived shows a boy of perhaps 7 years old, sitting perfectly still in a formal kimono, his hands placed precisely on his knees in the position of proper respect, his face so serious it appeared almost sculptural, devoid of the spontaneity that usually characterized children of that age. His father insisted he learn engineering, but not through books alone. Kiichiro was required to disassemble looms, piece by piece, until he could reconstruct the entire mechanism blindfolded, understanding not just how each component functioned, but why it had been designed that way, what problem it solved, what compromise it represented. By the time he was 16, Kiichiro could walk through the factory and identify which machines needed maintenance simply by the sound they made, a skill that impressed workers but seemed to bring him no joy. He studied mechanical engineering at Tokyo Imperial University, graduating in 1920, and immediately joined his father's company, working not in management but on the factory floor, learning every process from material selection to final quality inspection. His father's plan was transparent and unambiguous. Kiichiro would inherit the loom business, but more importantly, he would be the one to fulfill Sakichi's ultimate vision, the creation of a Japanese automobile industry that could rival anything produced in America or Europe. The weight of this expectation was immense, crushing, and Kiichiro bore it with a stoicism that those who knew him interpreted as dedication but, which his private writings, discovered much later, revealed to be something closer to resignation, a sense that his life's path had been determined before he was conscious enough to choose differently. In 1929, Sakichi sold the patent rights to his automatic loom to a British company called Platt Brothers for £100,000 sterling, an enormous sum, roughly equivalent to tens of millions in contemporary currency. He gave the money to Kiichiro with a single instruction that was equal parts commission and curse: build automobiles. Not as a hobby, not as an experiment. Build them as a business that would define Japan's industrial future. Kiichiro was 35 years old. He had spent his entire adult life learning to make looms better, faster, more reliable. He knew almost nothing about automobiles except that they represented everything looms did not: speed, power, individual freedom, modernity in its most seductive form. He began by purchasing foreign vehicles, Chevrolets and Fords mostly, and disassembling them in the same methodical way he had learned to disassemble looms, studying every component, every tolerance, every material choice. He discovered quickly that automobiles were vastly more complex than looms, requiring precision engineering in steel, rubber, glass, electrical systems, and internal combustion mechanics simultaneously. But he also discovered something else, something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: that copying was easier than innovating, that the gap between Japanese manufacturing capability and American manufacturing capability was so vast that any attempt to create something genuinely original would fail, leaving only the option of imitation refined through incremental improvement. This realization humiliated him in ways he never articulated publicly, but which manifested in his increasingly withdrawn demeanor and his insistence on working alone, late at night, in sections of the factory where no one would witness his failures. The mansion was built in 1937, the same year that Kiichiro formally established Toyota Motor Company as a subsidiary separate from the loom manufacturing business, signaling his commitment to making his father's vision reality. The location he chose was unusual, neither in the center of Nagoya where most industrial executives maintained their primary residences, nor in Tokyo where corporate power was concentrated, but rather in a semi-rural area east of the city, surrounded by forested hills and rice fields, accessible only by a single, unpaved road that turned to mud during the rainy season. The isolation was deliberate. Kiichiro wanted a place where he could separate himself completely from the factory, from the offices, from the constant demands of managers and engineers who looked to him for decisions he often felt unqualified to make. The design he commissioned was a peculiar hybrid of traditional Japanese architecture and Western modernism, with a central structure built in the Suki-Azukari style, featuring tatami rooms arranged around a courtyard garden, but connected to a western wing with hardwood floors, upholstered furniture, and a library designed to house technical manuals and engineering texts from Europe and America. The entrance was dominated by a gate carved from a single massive kiyaki tree, its wood so dense it had required 16 men 3 days to position it properly, and bearing a family crest that Kiichiro had designed himself, combining elements of the Toyota family symbol with geometric patterns meant to represent the gears and pistons of an automobile engine. The gate cost more than most workers earned in a year. The courtyard garden featured stones transported from Kyoto, each one selected personally by a master gardener who had worked for the imperial family, arranged to create a landscape of miniaturized mountains and valleys that was meant to be viewed from a specific window in Kiichiro's study, where the perspective created an illusion of infinite depth. The western wing contained a garage built to house 6 automobiles. Though Kiichiro kept only 3 there at any given time, all of them prototypes from the Toyota production line. Vehicles he would drive at night on the empty roads around the property, testing, handling, and performance in conditions that would never appear in official reports. But the mansion's most distinctive feature, the element that would later become the center of speculation and rumor, was the basement. Unlike traditional Japanese homes, which rarely included below-ground construction due to earthquake risk and water table concerns, Kiichiro's mansion featured an extensive basement level, excavated deep into the hillside and reinforced with concrete walls nearly a meter thick. The official purpose, as explained to the construction crew, was storage for company documents and technical drawings, materials too sensitive to keep at the factory where industrial espionage was a constant concern. But the design suggested something more complex. The basement was divided into multiple chambers, connected by narrow corridors that turned at odd angles, creating a maze-like quality that seemed excessive for simple storage. The largest chamber, located at the deepest point of the structure, contained a ventilation system far more sophisticated than anything else in the building, with ducts that extended up through the hillside to emerge at ground level nearly 50 meters away, disguised as natural rock formations. The lighting was minimal, bare bulbs hanging from concrete ceilings, creating shadows that made the space feel less like a basement and more like a bunker. A place designed for hiding, or perhaps for working on projects that required absolute secrecy. Workers who participated in the construction reported that Kiichiro visited the site almost daily during the excavation phase, sometimes descending into the unfinished basement and remaining there for hours, examining the concrete work, testing the strength of the walls with his hands, as if he were preparing for some future contingency that only he could foresee. The mansion was completed in March of 1938, and Kiichiro moved in with his wife Hatako and their 3 children during a period when Toyota Motor Company was experiencing its first genuine success. The model, AA sedan, introduced a previous year, had sold well, establishing Toyota as a credible automobile manufacturer in the Japanese market, though still far behind established American brands in both quality and volume. But success brought new pressures. The Japanese government, increasingly militaristic and expansionist, began demanding that domestic manufacturers shift production toward military vehicles, trucks, and transport machinery for the growing war effort. Kiichiro resisted initially, arguing that the company's long-term viability depended on perfecting passenger vehicle technology. But resistance to military contracts was increasingly interpreted as disloyalty, even treason. By 1939, Toyota was producing more military trucks than civilian automobiles, and Kiichiro found himself managing a company that had diverged completely from his father's original vision. The mansion, which he had imagined as a refuge, became instead a kind of prison, a place where he would retreat after long days at the factory, only to spend his evenings in the basement, working on personal projects that he shared with no one, not even his family. His wife would later describe this period as the beginning of his withdrawal, the point at which the man she had married began to disappear behind a facade of obsessive focus and emotional unavailability that no amount of conversation or concern could penetrate. The parties began in 1940, a strange development given the increasingly austere atmosphere of wartime Japan. Kiichiro would host gatherings at the mansion, inviting not just business associates and engineers, but an eclectic mix of artists, writers, musicians, and intellectuals, people who seemed to have no connection to the automobile industry or to his life as an executive. The parties were elaborate, excessive by the standards of the time, featuring imported whiskey and French wine that had become nearly impossible to obtain, meals prepared by chefs brought from Tokyo restaurants, and entertainment that included traditional shamisen performances alongside. Western jazz music played on a gramophone Kiichiro had purchased in Osaka. Guests would arrive in the late afternoon and often stay until dawn, moving through the various rooms of the mansion, drinking and talking, and occasionally disappearing into the garden or the western wings, library for private conversations that the other attendees could only speculate about. What made these gatherings particularly unusual was Kiichiro's behavior. He would circulate among the guests for the first hour or two, playing the role of gracious host, but then he would vanish, retreating either to his study or to the basement, leaving his wife to manage the social obligations. Some guests reported seeing him through windows, standing alone in the courtyard garden, smoking cigarettes and staring at the stone arrangements as if they contained answers to questions he couldn't articulate. Others claimed to have heard sounds from the basement, metallic clanging, and the whir of machinery, suggesting that even during these social events, Kiichiro was working on something, some project that couldn't wait, some obsession that demanded attention regardless of context. The parties grew larger and more frequent throughout 1940 and 41, reaching a peak in the months just before Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, almost as if Kiichiro understood that something fundamental was about to change and was trying to create moments of beauty and excess while they were still possible. December 7, 1941, the day Japan formally entered the Pacific War, marked the end of the parties and the beginning of what Kiichiro's personal assistant would later describe as the darkest period of his life. Toyoda was immediately placed under direct military oversight, with government officials installed in management positions to ensure full compliance with production quotas for military equipment. Civilian automobile manufacturing ceased entirely. The factory ran 24 hours a day, producing trucks, aircraft components, and eventually parts for kamikaze training planes, work that Kiichiro supervised with mechanical efficiency but visible disgust. His visits to the mansion became less frequent. He would sometimes sleep in his office at the factory for days at a time, subsisting on rice balls and tea, emerging only to inspect production lines or attend mandatory meetings with military authorities. When he did return home, he would go directly to the basement, often remaining there through the night, and in the morning his wife would find him asleep at the desk in his study, surrounded by technical drawings that appeared to have nothing to do with military production. Sketches of automobile designs that would have been considered frivolous or even subversive given the wartime context. She began to worry that he was having some kind of breakdown, a concern she shared with his younger brother Risaburo, who had taken on more management responsibility at the company as Kiichiro became increasingly withdrawn. But Risaburo interpreted the behavior differently. He believed Kiichiro was planning for the future, designing the vehicles Toyota would build after the war, preparing for a reconstruction phase that might come in 5 years, or 10, or never, but which Kiichiro needed to believe in as a way of maintaining some sense of purpose beyond mere survival. The bombing of Nagoya began in December of 1944, part of the American strategic bombing campaign targeting Japanese industrial centers. The Toyota factories were hit repeatedly, suffering extensive damage that killed dozens of workers and destroyed machinery that had taken years to develop. Kiichiro was at the main plant during one of the raids, supervising an evacuation, when a bomb struck the adjacent building, the concussion wave throwing him against a concrete wall and leaving him unconscious for several minutes. When he woke, his first words, according to witnesses, were not about casualties or damage, but a question about whether the basement at his mansion had been hit. It hadn't. The mansion's location, far from the city center and surrounded by forest, had spared it from the bombing raids, though the sounds were audible even at that distance. A rolling thunder that would begin after dark and continue for hours, shaking the ground and rattling the windows. Hatsuko and the children had been evacuated to relatives in the countryside by this point, leaving Kiichiro alone in the mansion during his increasingly rare visits. Neighbors would later report seeing lights in the basement windows late at night, glowing faintly through the ventilation grates, and hearing sounds that might have been machinery or might have been something else. Rhythmic pounding like a massive heartbeat emanating from beneath the earth. One farmer who lived nearby claimed he saw Kiichiro standing in the courtyard garden during an air raid, illuminated by searchlights sweeping the sky, his face tilted upward, watching the bombers pass overhead with an expression that the farmer described as not fear, but fascination, as if he were studying the aircraft the same way he had once studied looms and automobiles, analyzing their design even as they carried destruction toward the city. August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and the world that Seiichi Toyoda had built, that Kiichiro had attempted to fulfill, collapsed. The factories were in ruins. The workforce was decimated. The military contracts that had sustained the company through the war years vanished overnight. Toyota, like every other Japanese industrial enterprise, faced potential dissolution by the occupying American forces, who viewed large corporations as having enabled the militarist government and were inclined to break them apart. As part of the democratization process, Kiichiro returned to the mansion in September of that year, finally reuniting with his family, but those who saw him described a man who had aged 20 years and 5, his hair gray, his movements slow, his eyes holding a blankness that suggested he had seen things he couldn't unsee. He stopped going to the factory entirely for several months, delegating all management decisions to Risaburo and other executives, spending his days in the mansion doing nothing or nothing visible. He would sit in the courtyard garden for hours, watching the stones and the carefully pruned trees, or he would walk through the rooms of the western wing, running his hands along the bookshelves, picking up technical manuals and putting them down without opening them. His wife attempted to engage him in conversation about the future, about what would happen to the company, to their finances, to their family, but he would respond with monosyllables or not at all, as if the capacity for planning or even basic communication had been exhausted by the war years. The only place he seemed to show any animation was in the basement. He would descend the stairs in the late afternoon and not emerge until the following morning, and when his wife tried to follow him once, concerned about his health and his state of mind, she found the door locked from the inside, something that had never been the case before. She knocked and called his name, but received no response. Only silence interrupted occasionally by sounds she couldn't identify. Metallic scraping or perhaps the shuffling of papers, noises that suggested activity but revealed nothing about its purpose. The reconstruction of Toyota Motor Company began slowly, painfully, in 1946 and 47. The The American occupation authorities, initially hostile to large Japanese corporations, gradually recognized that the economic recovery of Japan would require industrial capacity, and that companies like Toyota represented expertise in infrastructure that couldn't easily be replaced. Kiichiro was allowed to resume leadership of the company. Though under close supervision and with restrictions on what could be manufactured, the focus shifted to trucks and commercial vehicles, practical transportation for a nation rebuilding from devastation. But the process was grueling. Materials were scarce. Financing was almost non-existent. Labor relations were tense, as workers demanded better conditions and pay, while management struggled simply to keep the factories operational. Kiichiro, thrust back into active leadership, seemed to perform his duties with competence, but without passion, going through the motions of executive decision-making while showing none of the intensity that had characterized his earlier years. Colleagues noted that he rarely smiled, rarely engaged in the kind of informal conversation that had once been part of his leadership style. He was present but distant, functional but hollow, as if the war had removed something essential from his personality and left only the mechanical shell. The mansion during this period became a subject of strange rumors among company employees. Some claimed to have seen trucks arriving late at night, unloading crates whose contents were never explained. Others reported that Kiichiro had hired construction workers to make modifications to the basement, though what those modifications entailed remained unclear. A junior engineer, who had been invited to the mansion for a meeting, described walking past an open basement door and glimpsing what appeared to be a workshop filled with automobile parts, but not parts from current Toyota models, rather components that looked hand-fabricated, possibly prototypes or experimental designs, arranged on tables in a way that suggested ongoing work. When he asked Kiichiro about it later, the response was curt and dismissive. Personal projects, nothing related to the company, nothing that concerned anyone else. The crisis came in 1914 when Toyota faced potential bankruptcy due to post-war financial instability and labor disputes that had shut down production for weeks at a time. Banks threatened to withdraw financing unless the company implemented massive layoffs, cutting nearly 25% of the workforce to reduce costs. Kiichiro, as president, was forced to make the decision, a choice that violated every principle of corporate loyalty and employee welfare that Japanese business culture held sacred. The layoffs were announced in April, and the reaction was immediate and devastating. Workers protested, some violently. Labor unions condemned the decision as a betrayal. The media, particularly left-leaning publications, portrayed Kiichiro as a capitalist exploiter prioritizing profits over people, a characterization that was both unfair and impossible to defend given the economic reality. Kiichiro appeared at a company-wide meeting to explain the decision, standing before thousands of angry workers, and attempted to articulate the logic that saving the company meant sacrificing part of it, that the alternative was total collapse, that he took full responsibility for the pain this would cause. He spoke for nearly an hour, his voice steady but his hand shaking, and at the end he bowed deeply, holding the position for so long that people in the audience began to feel uncomfortable, uncertain whether he would ever straighten up again. The layoffs proceeded. Toyota survived, but Kiichiro's reputation, both within the company and in the broader business community, was irrevocably damaged. He was seen as a man who had failed to protect his workers, who had chosen the corporation over the people, and this perception, whether accurate or not, became the lens through which all his subsequent actions would be interpreted. In March of 1950, less than a year after the layoffs, Kiichiro Toyoda resigned as president of Toyota Motor Company. The official explanation was that he was taking responsibility for the financial crisis and the painful decisions it had necessitated, that stepping down was an act of accountability consistent with Japanese corporate tradition. But those close to him believed the resignation was more complex, driven not just by external pressure, but by an internal collapse, a recognition that he no longer had the will or the capacity to lead. His resignation letter, the document later discovered in the sealed factory basement, was formal and brief, expressing gratitude to employees, confidence in the company's future under new leadership, and a commitment to supporting Toyota's success in whatever capacity might be appropriate. It was unsigned, suggesting he had drafted it but perhaps never submitted it, or submitted a different version, leaving this one behind as a kind of ghost document, a record of intention that might not have matched reality. After the resignation, Kiichiro returned to the mansion and barely left. He declined invitations to industry events, refused interviews with business publications, and avoided contact with former colleagues except when absolutely necessary. His younger brother Risaburo, who had taken over as president, would visit occasionally, bringing updates about the company's recovery. But these visits grew less frequent as it became clear that Kiichiro had no interest in the information, no desire to remain connected to the organization he had spent 2 decades building. Hadako described him during this period as a man waiting, though for what she couldn't say, perhaps for death. perhaps for some revelation that would explain the trajectory of his life and make sense of the sacrifices and failures that defined it. The routine that Kiichiro established in those final years was rigid and strange. He would wake early, before dawn, and walk through the mansion lighting oil lamps, despite the availability of electric lighting, as if he preferred the flickering dimness to the clarity of modern illumination. He would spend the morning in the courtyard garden, often in silence, sometimes speaking to the stones as if they could hear him, reciting technical specifications from memory or describing problems in automobile design that had never been solved to his satisfaction. Around midday he would eat a simple meal, usually rice and pickled vegetables, prepared by a housekeeper who had been instructed to minimize interaction. The afternoons he spent in the Western Wing Library, reading technical journals from foreign countries, Germany and England and America, publications that arrived months out of date but which he studied with the same intensity he had brought to his engineering education decades earlier. And the evenings, always, he spent in the basement. The door would be locked. No one was permitted to enter. What he did down there remained a mystery even to his family, though the sound suggested metalwork assembly, the kind of hands-on engineering that he had done as a young man, learning his father's business. His wife once asked him directly what he was building, and his response was so quiet she barely heard it. Something that works. When she pressed for clarification, he said nothing more, simply turned and descended the stairs, closing the door behind him with a gentleness that somehow felt more final than a slam. Kiichiro Toyoda died on March 27, 1952, at the age of 57. The official cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, sudden and catastrophic, occurring while he was alone in the mansion's western wing. He was found by the housekeeper the following morning, collapsed on the hardwood floor near the library, one hand outstretched as if reaching for a book on the lower shelf, though which book and why remained unclear. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, employees and business associates and family members, a gathering that should have felt like a celebration of a life that had contributed significantly to Japan's industrial development, but which instead carried an atmosphere of melancholy and unfinished business, as if everyone present sensed that Kiichiro had died with something unresolved, some project incomplete, or some burden unshared. His brother Risaburo gave the eulogy, speaking about Kiichiro's dedication to their father's vision, his sacrifice during the war years, his courage in making difficult decisions during the post-war crisis. But the eulogy felt hollow, mechanical, as if even Risaburo recognized that the public narrative of Kiichiro's life was inadequate to capture what he had actually experienced, the internal struggles and private disappointments that had defined him more than any corporate achievement. After the funeral, the family made arrangements to sell the mansion. None of them wanted to live there. The place had too many associations with Kiichiro's decline, too much silence and sadness embedded in its architecture. But the sale process proved complicated. The property was expensive to maintain, too large for a private residence, but not suitable for commercial development given its isolated location. It remained empty for months while real estate agents attempted to find a buyer. And during that period, according to local residents, strange things began to happen. Lights would appear in the windows late at night, even though the electricity had been shut off and the building was supposedly unoccupied. Police investigated twice, finding no evidence of trespassing, no signs of forced entry, just empty rooms and that persistent smell of oil and metal that suggested machinery had been operated recently, though no machinery was visible. The courtyard garden began to overgrow, the carefully pruned trees extending wild branches, the moss spreading beyond its designated areas, the stones becoming obscured by fallen leaves and creeping vines, as if nature was actively reclaiming the space that had been so meticulously designed to represent control and order. The western wing suffered water damage when pipes burst during a cold winter, staining the hardwood floors and warping the bookshelves. Though the books themselves, hundreds of technical manuals in multiple languages, remained oddly pristine, as if someone had been protecting them even as the rest of the structure deteriorated. But the basement, when investigators finally forced open the locked door, revealed something that no one had anticipated. The large chamber at the deepest level contained not just a workshop, as suspected, but a complete automobile, fully assembled, unlike any model Toyota had ever produced. The design was streamlined, almost futuristic, for the early 1950s, with a body shape that suggested careful attention to aerodynamics and a level of craftsmanship that could only have been achieved through hand fabrication, every panel beaten into shape individually, every component fitted with precision that exceeded industrial standards. The engine was partially disassembled, surrounding tools suggesting that Kiichiro had been working on it shortly before his death, perhaps trying to solve some final problem, some performance issue that prevented the vehicle from being complete. On the workbench nearby sat a notebook, its pages filled with calculations and sketches, annotations in Kiichiro's handwriting describing modifications and improvements, a record of obsessive refinement that had continued right up until the end. The investigators photographed everything, documented the discovery in official reports, and then, on instructions from Toyota's legal department, sealed the basement again, declaring the entire finding proprietary company information not to be disclosed publicly. The automobile, the notebooks, the workshop tools, all of it disappeared into corporate archives, never to be mentioned in any official company history. The mansion changed hands multiple times over the following decades. In 1955, it was purchased by a pharmaceutical company and converted into a research facility. The residential spaces transformed into laboratories, the garden paved over to create parking, the western wing gutted and rebuilt with industrial ventilation systems. But the facility closed within 3 years after researchers complained about the atmosphere, describing a pervasive sense of melancholy that made it difficult to work, as if the building itself was mourning. In 1962, a religious organization bought the property and attempted to establish a meditation retreat, believing the isolated location would be conducive to spiritual practice. That experiment lasted even shorter, less than 18 months. After multiple members reported disturbing dreams and a sensation of being watched, particularly in the areas that had once been the basement, which had been partially filled in but not completely eliminated, the building was abandoned again, this time for nearly a decade, slowly deteriorating as weather and neglect took their toll. In 1973, the city of Nagoya acquired the property through eminent domain, intending to demolish it and use the land for public housing. But the demolition was delayed by bureaucratic complications and budget limitations. And during that delay, the mansion became something else, a legend. Local teenagers began visiting the site at night, daring each other to enter the ruins, spreading stories about ghostly apparitions and strange noises. Some claimed to have seen a figure in a western suit standing in the courtyard where the garden had been, looking up at the sky as if watching for bombers that hadn't flown in 30 years. Others reported finding objects in the basement area, machine parts and hand tools that shouldn't have been there, given how thoroughly the space had supposedly been cleared, as if the building was regenerating its history, refusing to let go of its purpose. The photograph that the demolition crew found in 2007, the one showing Kiichiro standing before the gate, became the center of renewed interest in the mansion's history. Toyota, by that point one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the world, initially declined to comment on the discovery, maintaining its decades-long silence about Kiichiro's private projects and the circumstances of his later years. But the photographs circulated online, and historians began investigating, piecing together the story from property records, employee testimonies, and fragments of correspondence that had survived in various archives. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had been given an impossible task: to fulfill his father's dream of creating a Japanese automobile industry from almost nothing, during a period of war and devastation and financial instability, and who had succeeded in the corporate sense but failed in every personal measure that mattered to him. The automobile found in the basement, which remained classified and unavailable for public viewing, became the subject of intense speculation. Some believed it represented Kiichiro's vision for what Toyota vehicles should have become, a level of quality and innovation that the company's production reality never allowed him to achieve. Others interpreted it as a form of escape, a project that let him work as an engineer rather than an executive, solving problems that had clear technical solutions rather than the messy human and financial problems that defined his professional life. A few suggested something darker, that the vehicle was never meant to be completed, that it was a kind of monument to failure. Kiichiro's acknowledgement that some visions are impossible to realize and that the attempt itself might be a form of madness. The final demolition of the mansion began in 2008, a process that took nearly 6 months due to the complexity of the basement structure and the need to conduct environmental testing on materials that might contain asbestos or other hazardous substances. Workers reported that the demolition felt wrong, as if they were destroying something that wanted to remain intact, walls crumbling in ways that seemed almost intentional, as if the building was controlling its own collapse rather than submitting to their machinery. The gate, that massive Kiyaki carving that Kiichiro had commissioned in 1937, was removed carefully and transported to a Toyota corporate facility where it was placed in storage, too symbolically significant to destroy but too associated with difficult history to display publicly. The stones from the courtyard garden were scattered, some sold to collectors, others simply buried under the new construction that would eventually occupy the site, a shopping center and apartment complex that bore no indication of what had stood there before. The basement, that labyrinth of concrete chambers and strange ventilation systems, was filled with rubble and sealed under tons of earth, erased from physical reality, though not from memory or record. But one element remained, inadvertently or perhaps deliberately preserved by workers who understood they were participating in the erasure of something important. In the deepest section of the basement, the chamber where Kiichiro's hand-built automobile had been found, they left a small void, a space just large enough for a person to enter if they knew where to look and were determined enough to move the necessary rubble. Inside that void, they placed a metal box containing copies of all the documents they had discovered during demolition. The photographs, the notebooks, the resignation letter, even a small piece of the automobile's chassis that had broken off during removal. They sealed the entrance with a concrete slab marked only with the date and a simple inscription in Japanese. Here worked a man who built what he could not complete. The legacy of Kiichiro Toyoda and his forgotten mansion exists now primarily in fragments and absences, in stories told by people who knew someone who had visited the site, in photographs that circulate online with disputed authenticity, in corporate archives that remain inaccessible to researchers and historians. Toyota Motor Corporation, which became the world's largest automobile manufacturer in the early 21st century, acknowledges Kiichiro as a founder and visionary. But the narrative they promote is sanitized, focusing on his engineering brilliance and business acumen while omitting the depression, the resignation, the years of isolation, the hand-built automobile that represented either genius or madness depending on interpretation. The company museum in Nagoya contains a small exhibit about him, featuring photographs from his early years, the Model AA sedan that established Toyota's credibility, and a carefully worded plaque describing his contributions to Japanese industrial development. But there was nothing about the mansion, nothing about the basement workshop, nothing about the final years when he disappeared from public life and spent his evenings building something that no one would ever drive. This omission is not necessarily conspiratorial or malicious. It might simply reflect a discomfort with ambiguity, a preference for narratives that resolve cleanly rather than trailing off into questions without answers. Or it might reflect something deeper, an understanding that the truth about Kiichiro's life undermines the mythology that corporations require to function, that acknowledging his struggles and failures would force a recognition that success is often built on foundations of despair, that the men who create empires are often destroyed by the weight of expectations they cannot fulfill, that the places they inhabit become marked by their suffering in ways that persist long after the buildings themselves are demolished. What remains now, on the site where Kiichiro Toyoda's mansion once stood, is a landscape of studied normalcy, commercial spaces and residential buildings designed to be forgettable. Generic architecture that could exist anywhere and therefore carries no specific memory or meaning. Shoppers move through the stores unaware they are walking over sealed basements and buried gardens, over the compressed history of a man who tried to transform his nation's industrial capacity while losing himself in the process. But occasionally, according to some who work in the area, there are disruptions, small anomalies that suggest the past is not as thoroughly buried as the present would prefer. Electronics malfunction in specific sections of the shopping center, always the same locations, with no identifiable cause. The ground in one corner of the parking lot develops cracks that reappear no matter how many times they are repaired, following patterns that some observers claim resemble the layout of the mansion's courtyard garden. And late at night, when the commercial district is empty and quiet, people report hearing sounds from beneath the pavement, faint but distinct, like metal being worked by skilled hands, like an engine turning over and failing to start, like a man in a basement workshop trying one more modification, one more adjustment, believing that if he can just solve this final problem, if he can make this one thing work correctly, then everything else, all the disappointment and loss and compromise, will have been worth it, will have meant something more than the simple accumulation of failures that his life sometimes seemed to be. These reports are dismissed, naturally, as urban legend or psychological projection, the tendency of human minds to find patterns and meaning in random events. But dismissal does not equal resolution, and the sounds continue, unverified but persistent. A haunting that is less about ghosts in the traditional sense and more about the refusal of certain truths to remain buried, the insistence of history on making itself felt even when every physical trace has been methodically removed. The final question, the one that underlies all the speculation and research and fragmentary evidence, is what Kiichiro Toyoda believed he was building in those final years in the basement of his mansion. Whether the automobile found after his death was truly meant to be a vehicle or whether it served some other purpose, a way of keeping himself occupied, a physical manifestation of perfection he couldn't achieve in life, a message to a future that might or might not care enough to decode it. His notebooks, which remain in Toyota's corporate archives and have never been fully analyzed publicly, reportedly contain not just technical specifications but philosophical reflections, passages where the engineering calculations give way to meditations on legacy and responsibility, on what it means to inherit someone else's dream and whether fulfilling that dream constitutes success or merely elaborate obedience. In one passage that has been partially quoted in academic papers about Japanese industrial history, Kiichiro allegedly wrote, "My father gave me money and told me to build automobiles. He did not ask if I wanted this. He did not consider that I might fail. He saw only the machinery and the future it would create, not the man who would have to create it, not the cost that creation would exact. And so I built what he wanted, or tried to, And in the building I discovered that success and failure are not opposites, but rather different expressions of the same insufficiency, the same gap between human aspiration and human capability. The automobile in my basement will never be finished, not because I lack skill or knowledge, but because finishing it would mean admitting that this was all there was. But I spent my life chasing a vision that was never mine and achieved, a legacy that feels like someone else's shadow. The authenticity of this passage has been disputed, with some scholars arguing it is consistent with Kiichiro's documented writing style and psychological state, while others claim it is too literary, too self-aware, too conveniently profound to be genuine. But authentic or not, it captures something essential about the story of the mansion and the man who built it, the sense that some structures, physical or psychological, are erected not to be inhabited but to contain things that cannot otherwise be contained. Grief and disappointment, and the crushing weight of expectations that transform human beings into instruments of other people's ambitions, leaving them functional but hollow, capable of impressive achievements while being fundamentally unable to experience those achievements as their own. The mansion is gone now, thoroughly erased from physical existence, replaced by structures designed for commerce and habitation, places where people pursue ordinary lives with no awareness of the extraordinary. Suffering that occurred on the same ground decades earlier. But erasure is never complete. Memory persists in unexpected forms, in stories that circulate despite official silence, in documents that survive despite attempts at comprehensive destruction, in a psychological residue that locations carry long after the events that marked them have concluded. The gate, stored in some Toyota facility, remains intact, that massive carved kiyaki bearing the family crest Kiichiro designed, waiting for a future decision about its disposition, whether to display it as a historical artifact or to destroy it as an embarrassing reminder. The automobile from the basement sits in climate-controlled storage, if it still exists at all, slowly becoming less a vehicle and more a relic, an object whose significance has been transformed by time and context, from potential transportation to symbol of something larger and more melancholy than any machine could intentionally represent. And somewhere beneath a shopping center in Nagoya, sealed under concrete and earth, that small void contains its metal box of documents, a deliberate act of preservation by workers who recognized they were participating in something more complex than demolition, who understood that some stories resist erasure and demand to be kept, even if only in hidden form, even if only for the possibility that someday someone will care enough to dig through the rubble and discover what was deliberately left behind. The story of Kiichiro Toyoda's forgotten mansion is ultimately not about mansions or automobiles or corporate history, though it involves all these things. It is about the distance between vision and reality, between the person someone is expected to be and the person they actually are, between public success and private collapse, between the monuments human beings build to demonstrate their achievements and the spaces where those same human beings retreat to confront their failures. Is about inheritance, both material and psychological, about the burden of carrying forward someone else's dream and the possibility of ever knowing whether you have succeeded or failed in that carrying, whether you have honored the inheritance or betrayed it, whether your life has been an achievement or merely an elaborate performance of achievement while something essential inside you withered from neglect. And it is about places, about how physical structures absorb the emotional reality of the people who inhabit them, becoming repositories of experience that persist long after those people are gone, radiating a presence that sensitive individuals can detect even when all the explicit evidence has been removed, all the photographs destroyed, all the documents sealed, all the architecture demolished and rebuilt. The mansion where Kiichiro Toyoda spent his final years is gone, but it is not absent. It exists now in a different form, as story and symbol and psychological geography, as a reminder that some things cannot be erased simply by physical destruction, that the weight of certain lives leaves impressions that no amount of concrete can completely cover, that history has a way of insisting on itself even when the present would prefer to forget, rising up through cracks in the pavement like groundwater seeping through basement walls, cold and persistent and impossible to fully contain, carrying with it the sediment of all that has been buried and all that refuses to stay buried, whispering its truth to anyone who stops long enough in the empty parking lot late at night and listens carefully beneath the ambient noise of traffic and commerce and ordinary life, listening for the sound of a man in a basement workshop trying one more time to make something perfect, trying one more time to build something that works, trying one more time and failing and trying again forever. Because that is what inheritance demands. That is what legacy requires. That is what it means to be human and mortal and burdened with expectations that no achievement can ever truly fulfill.